now. And so this is the first webinar in the series that our climate declaration has been organizing over the last couple of years. The general topic has been on the economy of enough. It's a term that Jeanette Fitzsimons created some time ago, and she wrote a really excellent little booklet describing that. And I'm sure that you will cover many of the ideas in there as well as some additional ones. Our series has covered a broad range of topics related to the economy of enough, and most of the webinars are available on the Our Climate Declaration website. So you can, if you've missed any of past ones, you are welcome to go and have a look at some of the ones that have been presented already. And this session will also be put on that website. So the format will be that you will be speaking for about 30 minutes plus or minus, and then we'll have an open question and answer session. So everyone will have an opportunity, well, many of you hopefully will have an opportunity to ask questions, and we can have more of a dialogue about these important issues. I'm curious as to how many of you that are currently here are members of the Green Growth Group for the Green Party. Could you please use the reaction at the bottom of the screen, and as I've done on my screen here, just put up a hand and signify that you're a member of the Green Growth Group for the Green Party. I'm just curious as to how many.
Do you mean degrowth?
I'm sorry, yes.
Degrowth Greens
not
Network.
green growth. No, we're not about green growth. It's about degrowth. Thank you, Judy. So if you would put up your hand with the reaction at the lower part of your screen. It'd just be interesting to see how many we have. Okay, so it's interesting. There are a number of people who are not part of that, but are still interested in the whole degrowth issue. And I think that's terrific. So I'm just curious about that. Okay, you can lower your hands now, but you can put them up later when we have a Q&A. So you also know how to do that. And I'll try to recognize them and go through. So Hugh Ferguson has done a number of things in his life, including in the theater and IT. And he's become very interested in this issue of degrowth and has gone to some extent to educate himself and has become very knowledgeable about it. And as I understand it, Hugh was either the or at least one of the founders of the Green Degrowth Group and has been very instrumental in making that happen and organizing and providing material for it. So we're very fortunate to have him available this evening to give us a bit of an overview of degrowth. And I asked them, I said that the folks that are likely to attend are likely to already understand a lot of the reasons for the need for degrowth, and that hopefully we can touch upon that a bit, but not dwell on that, but move on to what do we do about it. So we're hoping that the focus of our discussion could be more on how we deal with the challenge of overconsumption and actually have a sustainable future. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you very much.
The chair is yours.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh. Okay. I thought I would take a different approach with this session. I have a sort of spiel that I go through about degrowth, but I wanted to put a different spin on it by looking at some of the narratives, some of the issues that confuse the degrowth issue. But first, just a little bit more background about me. I'm basically an economics skeptic, and have been for some time, since I first read a little booklet called the Anti-Economist Papers from way back. And I suppose you could say that's what I am, an anti-economist. So I have some formal study in ecological economics, but mostly I'm self-taught. My position on degrowth is, I suppose, a little bit specialized. I'm only really interested in implementing degrowth. There's an awful lot of academic and activist discussion about degrowth. If you have a look at some of the websites like degrowth.info, and look at some of the listings of papers for some of the conferences, you'll find a huge range of discussions, often quite abstruse, and to my mind not very pragmatic. So that's what I want to focus on tonight. There are a lot of, I suppose, dualities, if you like, in degrowth, things that are counter to each other. First, there's issues around the confusion between post-growth and degrowth. There's a lot of focus on the ends of degrowth, where we want to be, that utopia we want to be in, but there's very little focus on the means to get there. Voluntary and involuntary degrowth. I suppose you could say involuntary degrowth is chaotic collapse. What we're aiming for is a planned degrowth. We know it's going to happen anyway. We need to plan accordingly. The big one, the big issue I find with talking about degrowth is the conflict between, if you like, realism and hope. An awful lot of time, I was going to say gets wasted, but I guess not wasted. There's an awful lot of discussion on how we portray degrowth to the public. As I say, I'm a skeptic. I've spent a lot of time looking at the out and out bullshit that comes from the economics discipline and from those reacting against the environmental movement. So I tend to possibly overstate realism. I think it's utterly important that in what is really a last-ditch attempt to deal with climate change, that we be as realistic as possible. I have found that in meetings, discussions in the Degrowth Greens network, that people get quite demoralized by that. So one of the big issues is how we are going to balance realism against hope. Post-growth versus degrowth. Oh, sorry, before I go on, I should state my definition of degrowth. So I define degrowth as the deliberate, planned, stable reduction in the scale of the economy to attain a final steady state well within the biophysical limits of the Earth system, while maximizing equitable well-being within those constraints. So we'll refer back to that as we go on. The first, one of the most confusing dualities with degrowth is the contrast between post-growth and degrowth. It's very blurred, and possibly much the same issues come up in both areas. Many of the same policy proposals come up in both areas. I tend to define post-growth as looking at where we want to get to, what things are going to be like after growth has been reduced and a steady state has been reached. Whereas degrowth, I think, is more about how we go about degrowing, how we go about reducing the size of the economy. Now that's maybe a bit of an arbitrary distinction, as I say, because much the same, the discourse is very much the same in both. I'm possibly, the main point is that one, if I can dare to say it, is a bit utopian, whereas the other should at least aspire to be more pragmatic. And that, as I say, is my focus, is on how we can practically bring about degrowth. Tied to that is, I've been reading a lot of critiques of degrowth recently, mainly around policy. And the consensus seems to be that as far as policy prescriptions go, they're vague. They're a mixture of goals and objectives and actual policies, mechanisms, et cetera, and there is actually very little said about the process of degrowth, the actual trajectory of the transition. And I agree with the critics. This is a big problem. Some of the critics point out that degrowth has been a thing for 20 years now, but we don't actually have much in the way of transition plans. Again, the ends, the goals are well explored, but the means to get there are not. Excuse me, just look at my notes. One of the best books that I've read about degrowth, about actually implementing degrowth, is the Macroeconomics of D Growth by Timotei Parikh. And even that doesn't, even though it pays great attention to the policy process and how degrowth policies are formulated, it still doesn't come up with any sort of transition. There's a tendency to, in most prescriptions, simply to list a a number of policies and sort of plunk them down on the table and say, here they are, just do these and everything will be okay. I think that's naive for a number of reasons. The growth imperative of capitalism is immensely strong, and capitalism's tendency to commoditize, to create new markets, and so on is so pervasive that I don't think that any of the policies that I've seen proposed of themselves are powerful enough to bring about degrowth. Examples range from dealing with inequality. I recently came across an article that suggested that given the huge wealth in the top 10% or the top 1%, that by dealing with that we could fund and provide, if you like, the gap, the wealth gap needed to accommodate degrowth. So redistribution would enable us to degrow. That's all very well, but what brings about the reduction in inequality? I've tended to, when thinking about policies for degrowth, classify them in 3 ways. Sorry. First of all, there are the policies we need to trigger degrowth, and that's the critical thing. That is what is lacking. And I'll talk about some possibilities in a minute. Next, we need policies that stabilize the system while undergoing degrowth. And again, I'll give some examples. And finally, we need to deal with or maintain or maximize people's well-being while undergoing degrowth. So what sort of policy, what sort of intervention would disable the capitalist growth imperative? There are certain ones that have been suggested. The doing away with debt-based money has been suggested as one possibility. Zero or even negative interest rates is another. And you can see that these are designed to act against the ability of businesses to expand. My preference is to focus on energy. As you all, I'm sure, know, energy, GDP, resource use, material throughput, fossil fuel use, and emissions are all highly correlated. So I think that is the best possible lever to disable that growth imperative. Now, some of those on its own, I'm not sure. I think it would be enough, but it's possible that some of the other policies I've just mentioned, like getting rid of debt-based money, would be needed in addition, if you like, to give the coup de grace to capitalist growth. the policies needed to stabilize the system. An example of the need for that is the effect of the relationship between a shrinking economy and private debt. As turnover, businesses turnover, as wages fall, et cetera, it's going to become harder and harder for businesses and people to service debt. Now, there's a range of policies been suggested for that. The most extreme example, I suppose, is proposals for debt jubilees, but I believe it is possible for, if you like, less sledgehammer approaches. Another example is as the economy shrinks and our exports decrease, what do we do about our balance of payments and the ability to buy the sort of technology that we need to maintain our essential infrastructure? So I see that as another big problem. And later in about a week or so, Degrowth Greens are going to talk to Jane Kelsey about the implications of this. Then finally, there are the policies needed to mitigate the effects of degrowth. And these are largely the policies that have already been proposed by people for degrowth, thinking that they are sufficient to bring about degrowth. And some examples are localization, a shorter working week, greater sharing of work time, a UBI or UBS. These are all big ticket sort of policies, of course. Then there are a lot of smaller ideas, if you like, such as urban gardens, et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me a minute. Jack, can I just ask how we're going for time?
Another 10, 15 minutes at least, would be fine,
Yep.
I think. Thank you.
Okay. So, as I said, that's my primary interest. I think we badly need to actually work on some sort of transition plan. And when I say that, I don't underestimate how huge a job it is. But partly it's important for its own sake, but it's important as something that needs to be seen to be done. And the reason for that is, just moving on to a different area, is the question of how we sell this politically. And I suppose my short answer to that is that we can't sell it politically. That's simply not possible. I've been reading recently about social tipping points. Supposedly, socially, the social system of ideas, groups, et cetera, civil society, is a complex system, and naturally it has tipping points. So the idea is that there may be tipping points that allow an idea to spread rapidly and be taken on comprehensively. Now that sounds like a very sort of vague and rather idealistic, hopeful wish, but I think it is the only way that degrowth is going to be accepted. So basically, to put it baldly, we're waiting for people to get so desperate at how things are going that the idea of degrowth becomes reasonable. That's obviously not enough in itself. We need to, we can hopefully bring that tipping point closer by promoting the idea of degrowth. And I'm very much in favor of simply making the idea of degrowth as common and pervasive as possible so that people are familiar with it. They may not take it seriously, but at least they have some idea of what's involved. Those more interested or more amenable perhaps have a better idea. So we're encouraging that tipping point to come closer. At the same time, we have to have some sort of transition plan again in place that gives weight to the idea of degrowth, so that people can see that there is a way out under degrowth. So I see that as the two arms of of a degrowth movement. Familiarizing the idea, educating people about it, and also backing that up with real concrete proposals for how degrowth is going to be implemented. As for a transition plan, as I say, there is very little in the literature that that helps in that area, and it is a huge undertaking here in New Zealand. Well, as far as economic models go, I don't know of any that deal with degrowth directly. There are a few people like Peter Victor and Tim Jackson who have done biophysical models of the Canadian economy. I talked to Peter Victor about how that might be adapted to look at degrowth, but there's very little not much possibility there. Steve Keen is got an economic model which is more based around money, but he is working on introducing energy into that model, and further down the track, biophysical, a biophysical aspect to the model. So there is a little going on. But here in New Zealand, about 10 years ago, when I started doing a ecological economics master's, the ecological economics department at Massey was looking at an input-output model for New Zealand. So in the intervening 10 years, there may be a lot more to work with. But I suspect that at least initially, any sort of transition plan that we were to come up with would be, shall we say, a qualitative one. How do we, going back to energy as the trigger for a degrowth transition, my money is on carbon rationing. I don't take the emissions trading scheme or in fact, any sort of pricing, carbon pricing approach all that seriously. I think that carbon rationing is the only technically feasible way of reducing emissions. To a certain extent, that's a rhetorical statement. You know, it is conceivable that if they managed to cobble together a better version of the emissions trading scheme, that may be effective in reducing emissions. But carbon pricing, carbon markets, emissions trading, frankly, have been pretty much designed to favor business, to give options for opportunities for business rather than specifically focusing on reducing carbon consumption and emissions. I don't see any point in promoting anything less than carbon rationing. As I've said, I'm a skeptic. Nothing I've seen in any of the so-called solutions for climate change have impressed me. You know, despite James Shaw's recent comments about us turning the corner on resource decoupling, nothing of any significance is happening there. So I believe, and I know Jack believes, that carbon rationing is the only technically feasible approach. It's a big sell, once again. So we fall back on that idea that it's a solution that we have ready, planned for, designed for, when the public, the government, becomes amenable to it. Okay, so I seem to have come to a natural point in my, I'll just double check my notes to see if okay, I seem to have covered everything, and I suspect we're rather early in the piece to start questions, but what do you think, Jack?
Okay. Thank you, Hugh. That was terrific. I think that has provided us with a really excellent overview of many of the basic issues. And, you know, I think we can all thank you for having thought through this process and identified some of the challenges that remain. You know, we can agree or disagree with various aspects of what he's suggesting, but he's done a terrific job of giving us something to respond to. So I thank you for that, Hugh, and I'm sure many others here will do that as well.
I have left out a lot of detail, which I hope will come out
Sure.
in questions.
One of the things, I know you have an extensive bibliography, and I assume that you're willing to share that with people. can you identify where it can be available? Or if you would like to send me a link, I can make sure that it goes up on the our climate declaration website.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to provide there.
Okay,
Yeah.
so just to let everyone know that in a few days' time, we'll put a link on the Our Climate Declaration website to the resources that you has identified. And I'm going to ask people to, again, use the hand raising tool at the bottom of your screen if you would like to put a question to you, and then we can have a discussion about it. I just want to make a brief comment about the fact that I think we have to accept that we don't know how to do this. The task is enormous. It's never been done before in anything like the kind of scale required. So I think we have to recognize and not beat ourselves up about it, but accept some humility that we're in uncharted waters. So we need to keep challenging each other. We need to keep sharing ideas and challenging each other and looking at, the many different aspects of this to see if, collectively we can, I'm not going to say solve the problem because I'm not sure there is a solution to the predicament we're in, but I do believe that we can make things less bad. And that would be a very important thing to do. So having said that, I see there's a couple of hands going up. And if any of you have put questions into the chat, I would appreciate you putting your hand up and you can deliver the question yourself. So we'll start out with Kath Wallace. Go ahead, Kath. And
Kia ora, and thanks, Hugh. I agree with a lot of what you say, but I think that other people are often quite scared of degrowth. I mentioned it the other day in a select committee hearing and got sort of what kind of reaction. And I do think we need to be much clearer about what we're saying is to shrink or degrow. And I don't know that it's helpful to make people feel that if we have less throughput in the economy and less consumption, that we will inevitably all feel worse off. And I think we need to acknowledge for sure that having some kinds of consumption are going to drive up energy use or carbon use or emissions. But I do think we need to be clearer. What is shrinking? What do we think should shrink? And how do we feel we can actually maintain quite a bit of well-being while doing that? Because really not saying whether you're talking about inputs or outputs or emissions or what leaves it up to people's imaginations, and that can scare people. Thanks.
Okay, couple of comments about that and also about what Jack said, and also referring back to my definition. I talked about the scale of the economy. My feeling is that we'll be damn lucky to get anything. And the first thing we have to do is deal with climate change. To get any reduction by any measure in the economy, whether it's throughput or energy or GDP, is absolutely essential. So I agree with you, but I think that our urgent task is simply to reduce the scale of the economy. Now, having said that, going back to what Jack said, I think this is going to be a very iterative process. We are going to, whatever we use to limit growth, limit the size of the economy, we will be capping and reducing year on year. But it's going to be absolutely essential to measure and measure the effects on the economy, on well-being, on equity, etc., the state of various environmental systems, and calibrate as we go and apply some of these mitigating policies as we go. So yes, we do need to emphasize that it's selective degrowth, but I tend to de-emphasize that because I feel that, as I said, with that three-part model, the first urgency is to degrow, simply to deal with climate change. And the stabilizing policies and mitigating policies will deal with ensuring that that we are selective, because part of the issue is going to be rather than trying to apply policies to reduce the size of the economy, we're reducing it and we're applying policies to make the best of that. And I think that's an essential distinction. So we'll be looking to cut energy use by, say, 5% a year. And having done that, look for ways to maximize the use of what we have. So we're going to have to be selective about what we spend that energy on. And part of this is that simply by reducing the scale of the economy, we are going to have knock-on effects that deal with a whole range of issues. But whether those knock-on effects are positive or negative depends on what mitigating policies we apply. Sorry, that was a bit garbled, but I hope you get the idea.
Okay, we'll go on to the next party. Although I'd just like to make a comment and suggest that one of the things we might think about in terms of what needs to decline. I mean, I would agree with you that everything needs to decline, but most importantly, overconsumption, consumption that does not contribute to human well-being, I think should be the first target. There's all kinds of waste and excessive consumption that we know. I mean, the top 10% of earners globally contribute 50% of the emissions and 50% of the damage done not only to the environment but to all the ecosystems. So changing the behavior of that top 10% in terms of the excess consumption, I think would go a long way to getting us where we need to be with climate as well as with overshoot. Okay, Robin, you had your hand up.
Sorry, Jack, can I just comment on that? One thing that I didn't delve into carbon rationing at all, and possibly I should have. But one of the points about carbon rationing is that it's a per person allocation. So to some extent, to a first approximation, that deals with that can deal with the issue of disproportionate consumption.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Hugh. Robin, go ahead.
Kia ora, and thank you for that, Hugh. You touched briefly on education, really, to bring the concept of degrowth much more into the public arena. You also made a comment that, having the plan sort of in place for when the public or government are ready for degrowth. And I kind of question whether they ever will be, whether it's by design or disaster. So I just wonder if you have any idea on how these concepts can be introduced so they can be seen as a good option for a livable future, you know, not a future of kind of loss and pain, but a good future. And I know we've discussed the concepts of needs versus wants, and sadly I think that's going to vary a lot between the 1% or the 10% and the rest of us, having seen the influx of big SUVs and motorboats and jet skis and so forth over the summer. But I come back to XR's tell the truth. If the public don't actually understand how dire the situation is, and that degrowth is going to happen by design or disaster, I can't see them being willing to, take the bitter medicine, as some may see it.
With my realism hat on, I agree with you. I think it's highly unlikely that the public will take this kindly. It's inevitable, really. But we have to try. The default is a chaotic, unplanned collapse, basically. I try not to use the word collapse anymore because it gets people up in arms, but it is a collapse. I mean, the latest estimate from the last iteration of the limits to growth study is 2040. So to some extent, I'm banking on people's increasing desperation. I should point out to another area that I left out is that we are already in degrowth. You know, we've been talking for about 30 years about secular stagnation, about how growth is tapering off in Western economies, the wage share is decreasing, productivity is decreasing, et cetera, et cetera. People are aware of all that. People are getting desperate. You could argue that, well, I know some people do argue that the stuff that's going on in Parliament grounds in Wellington is largely due to that. The increase in right-wing governments around the world, it's all due to this perception of that we're not progressing. Things are not getting better. And that, in fact, is one of the biggest arguments about the greatest objections to degrowth, that we need growth for social cohesion, for the sense of going somewhere, of improving. So that is inherently going to be lacking. I think you said we have to speak the truth as strongly as possible. Yes, I believe that. But we also have to, like I said, show that there are ways around it. And some comparisons with earlier times might be useful in that respect. I mean, to go back to the time when New Zealand was sustainable, I've heard various figures, various years bandied about, the 70s, the 50s, et cetera, et cetera. Those were not terrible times to live in. And being selective about what we give up, putting it to people that we must be selective about what we keep and what we give up, it puts, it gives them some autonomy in a sense, that they make the decisions about what is important, what they need in their lives, what we need to retain. So I think there's also a lot of material in the post-growth and degrowth movement about envisaging life after capitalism, after growth and after capitalism. And so those visions are there, and I think they can be publicized, and they may be seen as utopian. They certainly will be in the short term. But again, as people get more desperate, if we can show a path to those scenarios, to those alternative utopias, if you like, then that may make a difference.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Kaz, Sheldon, I believe you've had your hand up next. If you could unmute yourself, and if possible, start your video as well, Kaz. Thank you.
Okay, I came off video because I was eating. So sorry about that. Okay, I just wondered, how are you not bringing the sociologists and the psychologists into this conversation? And the reason I'm saying that is because again and again, I'm constantly seeing people saying what gives them the greatest pleasure, what gives them the greatest joy, what gives them the greatest sense of happiness in life is their connection with other people and their connection with the natural world, the sunrises and sunsets and, all these kinds of things, all these things that money can't buy.
Yeah.
And this, if the degrowth movement starts bringing its focus to well, where is real pleasure found? Then there's much less of an argument. There's much less concern about, what you might lose out on. And as long as we kind of carry on with the belief that, if you can't travel as often in your car, if you can't have whatever new gadget, whatever obsolescent built-in, fridge, whatever. How much happier would you be if your fridge lasted 30 years rather than 5?
Sure.
I mean, that's a very practical example. So I just feel like we're not selling degrowth in terms of actually increasing human happiness by increasing possibilities of connection between people and easier living. So that's what I wanted to bring up. And I just wondered, are there psychologists and sociologists being invited to come on board here?
Well, in the wider degrowth movement, there's just about everybody. There's no shortage of those perspectives, and to some extent, they're the perspectives of the existing sustainability movement, the well-being movement, independently of degrowth. So I think those things are there. What, to some extent, these utopias, I'll call them again, are seen as they're always sort of free floating and not connected to history and a way of getting there. And this is what I've tried to emphasize is those things are very good and they're essential, in fact, but how do we get from here to there? I mean, somebody may, and I'm sure people already do, think it would be wonderful to have a 3-day week, but how do they get to that? So, their dependency on the systems that surround them, they're embedded in those capitalist systems. how do they get out of those and get to a sustainable, low-level way of living? And that's what I'm concerned with. Sorry, that sort of didn't answer your question, but did in a way. So all those things you've mentioned are there. They are promoted by the degrowth movement, and there are people. It's truly amazing to look at the listings, the proceedings from the average degrowth conference. Every possible perspective is represented there.
Okay, thanks. Thank you both, Kaz and you. Paul Bruce, you're next.
Well, thank you, Hugh. We're all very conscious of increasing costs, inflation, and a lot of that's imported just because of the increasing costs of extraction of natural resources. And but basically that seems to be creating more inequities where the bit rich can buy what they want. And that seems to be an argument that a lot of people would support for rationing by allocation rather than price.
Yeah.
Hence resource allocation and rationing and tradable energy quotas. But you know, I guess as well alongside that, you need those other things which you did talk about, like universal public services and basic income and good social safety nets.
Yeah.
But and you know, a tax on the wealthy as well. But so can we use that argument of equity to get to a rationing scheme like TEQs, tradable energy quotas?
Absolutely, and I think it's one of the most powerful arguments. One thing I forgot while I think about it to mention was that part of the reason that I push energy as the trigger for degrowth is that climate change gives us the excuse, if you like. We know we have to get emissions down. It's the very first priority, but that allows us to ration energy. And that in turn will help deal with other problems. Simply reducing the size of the economy will deal with all sorts of environmental and some social issues. But yes, going back to equity, again, it is a good rationale for carbon rationing.
Okay, thanks to you both. John, I think you're next.
Thank you. I have for the last 10 years been studying new energy sources that don't emit carbon. And I don't know whether I see this as a relief or as more of a problem, but over the last, particularly the changes over the last year, I'm seeing at least 3 technologies that will be with us likely in the next 7 or 8 years by 2030, which will provide, I believe, carbon-free energy. Now, I don't look at this with delight because I think that if it happens, if we get abundant carbon-free energy, it doesn't necessarily mean that we won't continue ecological overshoot. In fact, it might accelerate ecological overshoot. But it does raise cautions in my mind about using carbon as the means to look at degrowth as a major limit. The more I look at the recent technology, the breakthroughs, and the recent business investment in these new technologies, the more I think that, like it or not, we may see relief of growth in the Earth's temperature over the next 15 years, which doesn't, in my view, totally eliminate the problems of ecological overshoot. but it does give for me caution about using carbon as the method of regulating that.
Okay. Can I just ask what the three technologies are that you mentioned? Yes,
certainly. The one of them is an old-fashioned technology, but it's now reached the point where it's cheaper to build than a power station, and that is the mirror hot salt system that runs 24/7. So it provides continuous energy. It has a relatively low cost of building, which is why it's now competitive with other sources of energy that we build. The second is the new development in small scale, relatively safe nuclear fission systems using hot sodium as the heat exchanger, which is what gives them their relative safety. And Bill Gates and others are looking at making these available at relatively low cost in the time frame of the next 4 or 5 years. And the last is the idea that I thought would never happen in less than 50 years, is the idea of nuclear fusion. But the breakthroughs that have happened over the last year, and the 3 or 4 companies now that are saying that they'll have systems available before 2030, is the third. That one is obviously the one that has least certainty to it, but the developments recently make me start to believe it will happen in that time frame.
Okay. My first question is, well, just in passing, there's an interesting blog by Tim Morgan, who promotes what he calls surplus energy economics. So I'd want to know about those technologies, what the energy return on energy invested would be, what the time frame.
I would love to spend time answering that question. I've done research into it.
Okay. So basically the question is, can we build those systems quickly enough? Is the energy return on energy invested sufficient? And is it sufficient, if you like, to fund in energy terms further building of those systems? I mean, another
those are the key questions, Hugh.
Yeah. So yeah, we'd have to get in a long debate about it, I guess. Personally, nuclear fusion, for the reasons you've given, it would be an unmitigated disaster, because it would give us free license to maybe not overshoot in carbon terms, but overshoot in other terms.
Yes.
So I dread the possibility. It's interesting to see. I saw a report the other day that that fusion is very much going private, but that's another issue. I've seen statistics quoted to deal with replace fossil fuels with fission systems, nuclear fission systems. I've seen statistics something like it would require the building of one new 300 megawatt fission plant I think it was every 2 or 3 days. The lead time on building them is something like 8 years. Given the absolute urgency of dealing with our carbon emissions, I don't know that they could, even if these technologies come to fruition, that there could be a solution in the short term. And I think it's the short term that matters.
I'd like to discuss those times with you. I don't want to extend my interrupt time here, but I think
maybe we'll have time to come back to it, John. There's at least 3 other folks, if you wouldn't mind holding some of those questions.
Not at all. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. And you, I know that degrowth is really important, but if you could turn a light on, people would like to see
Oh,
see your face.
sorry, good point.
So, and Kerry would be next, and then Patricia, and then Brian.
Hi. Hugh, I wonder whether you wanted to spend a minute or two describing something about how you envisaged practically implementing, accounting for, administering a carbon rationing system from a kind of practical point of view. And the other thing just I was wondering was something you said before about if the economy shrinks, it'll automatically reduce other kinds of destruction. That's not your words. I can't quite remember exactly what your words.
Yeah.
But I wondered if you had thoughts on like where externalities fit into that, and is there a risk that when the official monetized bits of the economy shrink, that actually more people might end up imposing externalities directly on the environment because they can't get what they were wanting through the official economy?
Yeah.
That was my question.
Okay, that's a very good point. There's possibly a good example of that. There's a lot of talk in the degrowth movement about localization. And to a certain extent, localization is an effect as much as a cause, that of necessity we will have to be more localized. But somebody I read recently, an Australian economist, sorry, I can't remember the name, pointed out that that's all very well, but what about the infrastructure that you need for localized communities, et cetera, do you duplicate that? And again, that's a symptom of thinking of these solutions as something that exists magically on their own and not how we get to them from here. Another example might be that as energy inputs decrease, the costs of a lot of agriculture will go up, and that means that that farms that are more marginal, at the moment, will be driven out of business. That means that that possibly, I don't know, but possibly a lot of land will go out of use. Now, you could that could be a positive thing or it could be a negative thing. I mean, how might it be exploited in other ways, especially as people get desperate about if they're allowed to become desperate, if they're not supported, they're allowed to become desperate about their livelihoods and what that might mean in terms of greater destruction of that land. It's not necessarily going to turn into verdant long life forests. So yes, that is a very good question, and that's one of the reasons we need those mitigating policies to direct the side effects I talked about in one direction or the other. And sorry, I've forgotten your first question.
My first question was about the technicalities, the technical, how do you implement a carbon, how might one possibly implement, if the government decided next week it wanted to implement a carbon rationing system, might it practically look like? How might you practically put something like that in place?
Most of these systems seem to rely on something similar to a debit card. That each person in the country would be allocated a certain amount of energy. Certain goods would have a price, an energy price on them, and that as you bought them, you would your energy debit card would be debited. So in essence, they rely on existing infrastructure. Steve Keen's system called Universal Carbon Credits goes all the way to pricing every commodity, and would rely on a digital currency. Clearly there's a lot more to it than that, depending on the nature of, the exact nature of the system. You'd have to, if we, products would have to be quantified in terms of carbon, okay, which means that with fossil fuels, or most fossil fuels, that would be a fairly straightforward process. So especially at point of importation, which would be the case here because we import most of our fossil fuels. Sorry, does that?
So can I just, I'll try not to drag it too long, but does that mean basically a dual accounting system alongside dollars?
Yeah.
Everywhere that dollars occur in the economy. So every shop, every trading operation would have to be.
Some schemes focus primarily on energy, and that is because that reduces the overheads of the parallel accounting that you've just referred to. So the range of fuels is fairly narrow. It's relatively easy to account for them. Other schemes go all the way to accounting for every product in terms of its carbon content. The infrastructure's there, or will be, especially if we go to digital currencies, but still it's a mammoth job. So just accounting for fuels, the 80-20 rule applies. You get the biggest bang for your buck simply by looking at fuels. There are other things like cement, for instance, and possibly it could be extended to that, but I'm not sure about how important cement is relative to actual fuels.
Does the system like that potentially take into account?
Excuse me, Carrie, I just want to give a couple of the other folks who have their hand up an opportunity. Thank you.
There's somebody there with their finger up. It's been worrying me.
I see Brian, but Patricia Scott's just ahead of Brian, and Brian will be next. Go ahead, Patricia.
Yes, kia ora everybody. You've talked a little bit about localization, and it's something that I've been involved with for many years, and it's something that's happening all over the world and all over New Zealand, only it's under the radar. But what seems to me the value of localization is that it is the best way to transition, because as the global economy declines, then the local economy can grow, and so that they go alongside each other. It seems to me that localization, I think this is what Hugh said, is going to be inevitable anyway, because globalization is so carbon intensive with long distance travel that we are going to have to go back to the sort of economy that we had in the 60s and 50s, where just about everything was made within 50, except for very rural places, 50 miles of where you lived or 100 miles of where you lived, whether it was furniture or your electric stove or clothes or shoes. And that doesn't seem to me to be too difficult a thing to work towards if we are charging for the amount of energy that's used for the travel. So the other thing that I wanted to ask you was, people are terrified of recession, and how do we describe degrowth in comparison with a recession?
Okay. About localization, I don't think we can say that the economy will necessarily be deglobalized. I mean, take New Zealand's position. We've got a very hollowed out economy. Our manufacturing took a hit back in the 80s. So I feel more that we're going to have to be extremely selective about what we import. That we are going to, there's a lot of technical infrastructure that we may still have to import or abandon. I mean, computer chips. I don't think we're ever going to make them here. We face a choice then between doing away with the things that need them, or prioritizing them as something we must import. And I think it's probably fair to say that the same applies between small localized communities and big cities or regional hubs, that there are certain things that are going to not necessarily need to be manufactured in regional hubs and dispersed to communities. But you mentioned stoves. If we have the infrastructure to build stoves in every local community, we will have to spend an awful lot of money and an awful lot of energy establishing that infrastructure. So food growing, probably very localized. Anything built, maybe not so much.
I was actually using the word localized. You can be localized in a small community, but I think you could still be localized within or to the extent of one big city or big towns, and that's still reducing the amount of transport that's required. Although you've got to transport the steel or whatever it is that you are using from the place where that comes from.
Oh, sure. Fair point. It's a relative term, I guess, is what we're both saying, rather than an absolute thing. But certainly localizing where possible is going to be essential.
I think talking about degrowth is absolutely going to put people off. I don't think we should even mention the word. It may be what happens, but if we focus on what we're going to do because we're going to reduce our carbon emissions, then these other things happen automatically. And they have really good social effects as well. So I think trying to sell a word like degrowth won't help.
Oh, there I have to absolutely disagree with you. I mean, I'm very much of the school of thought that, we have to face up to it. It is what it is. It is degrowing the economy. That's what we have to do.
So how's it different from a recession?
Excuse me, Patricia. Brian has been very patient with his hand up, and I think we'll give him a turn. Go ahead, Brian.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. I'm speaking for myself here, but probably there's a good deal of XR Tamaki Makarau behind what I'm saying as well. I think I just want to start from very briefly from a climate point of view and then ask a couple of questions. First of all, I don't think that the climate responds to our talk of degrowth and how we're going to maybe buy forests offshore to offset. I think the physics is a completely different issue. And just sort of leading on from this, are we expecting to degrow into more capitalism, essentially? Is that the system that's going to see us through? We're not going to mention degrowth, we're going to go local. I seem to remember Adrian Orr talking along these lines about 3 years ago. And I don't think that was tremendously successful. He never really got to the nub of the issue. And I agree, look, there's plenty of intelligent conversation gone here tonight. It's fantastic. I don't knock that. I think that Sir David King has said that we've got 3 to 4 years. I just put that into the chat earlier on, to change what we do, because it's going to alter the next 1,000 years of climate and environment on this planet. Are we going to manage that through capitalism in the next 3 to 4 years? Are we going to manage the markets somehow and manipulate them in the next 3 to 4 years by some kind of major PR strategy? I'm not sure how we're going to do that. I think being local is fantastic. That I just totally agree with you on that. So I just want to ask a couple of questions now, really, and it's about the fact: are we really going to degrow into capitalism? I think we need to be quite clear about that, whether we run a parallel currency or not. Is capitalism going to linger around in the background as it has done for 200 years plus? In fact, longer than that. We've had ups and downs with capitalism. And it's always there ready to come back. If we don't have something ready to go when the void is created, then we know who's going to step in, and it's not going to be the Degrowth Greens or Extinction Rebellion. It's going to be the capitalists with plenty of digital currency, which is completely meaningless. And I can talk at length of that about international banking. It's my total training. I mean,
Okay.
I put this into the country with Citibank, So that's an endless route, and we can't fight that. Yeah. I think the only thing, and really I'm just sort of wanting to plant a seed and ask opinion of this, is are we going to really go along talking about things, or are we actually going to do something? Are we going to join with other groups around the country, other movements? And I'm not talking about what's gone in Wellington in the last 2 weeks or so, which is just a copycat of Ottawa, which started a little bit before us. Are we going to go along that route and be totally disorganized, or are the left wing, for lack of a better term, going to get together from Extinction Rebellion through to Degrowth Greens and Greenpeace and the rest of us and Generation Zero and get together and face the government and say, we've got to get out of this system. We've got to change the political system, and we've got to change the economic system. Personally, I can't see any other way. I've looked at the things overseas. I mean, what do you think, guys? This is out to Hugh and everyone. Are we really going to change it talking like this? I'm being pretty harsh, I know. But this is the way we talk in Extinction Rebellion, Tamaki Makara. Okay, we need to get some action with younger people. Thanks, everyone. Okay, Hugh.
So was that a question to me or a question to the wider group?
It's a question. Well, Hugh, you're the main spokesperson or the main person here, so yeah, I guess it's you. But everyone else needs to think about it, I think, seriously.
Okay, very good question. My preferred approach, well, it just occurred to me, I don't know how I can answer that with just more talk, but I guess I have to. I don't believe in piecemeal solutions. I mention carbon rationing because I see that, if I'm right, I see that as a something that might unlock things, that might disable capitalism, perhaps with one or two other key policies. If I'm right, I think it's something that everybody needs to, something that needs to be pushed by every damn group in the country. And part of what we've been trying to do is make contact with other groups and try and persuade them of that. There are vested interests, reasons why people don't fancy the idea. People are committed to the ETS, and there are a host of reasons for that. But yes, I agree with you. I think that we need to, pardon me, I was about to say hold the government to ransom. In these times, that's probably not a good way to put it. But yeah, united action is essential, and I think not on multiple fronts, but choosing one lever to disable capitalism, because for me anyway, it's the only way.
Hugh, can capitalism, can this system bootstrap itself?
Excuse me, Brian, I'm just conscious of the time and kind of want to respect it, even though I think we're going to go over a little bit.
My apologies.
And Judy and Joel have a hand up there, so we'll give them an opportunity to ask a question. Go ahead, Judy or Joel.
Oh, well, that's actually me this time. It's not really a question. I'm finding some inspiration from a lot of what people are saying about challenging government policy and localizing and stuff. I'm also finding that there's a lot of sort of theoretical talk about how we might need to do this or that, but we probably aren't going to get there, is kind of how it sounds to me. And maybe I'm misunderstanding or misinterpreting. My concern is for those most vulnerable among us. What can they do? What can we do to help them to survive whatever is coming down the pike, which we can't know the shape of, but it doesn't look good from everything that I'm hearing from you. Sorry, having that problem. And the best answer that I can come up with is that people need to be encouraged and supported to take control of their own lives. People, I put the New Economy Coalition in the chat, New Economy something. Anyway, you can look up New Economy Coalition and find out what they're doing. But what they are doing is actually that they're supporting people who are taking power locally of their workplace, of their communities. These are the most vulnerable. When I say that, I'm talking about people of color, poor people, and they're doing that by establishing businesses that are actually run by the workers themselves. They're doing that by establishing communities that, by working towards communities that support community empowerment. And to me, that's the thing that can, if anything can, that's the one thing that can help us to sort of fill in where the disastrous system leaves us when it leaves us behind. So I guess it's not a question, it's more of a speech, but I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts on that.
Do you want me to comment on that, or?
Yeah, go ahead, you. If you could keep it brief, just because we're going over time. But thank you, Joel.
Are there more people waiting?
I don't believe so, but we're already a bit over time. So if
Oh,
you'd
okay,
like to
all right.
respond, make a comment. on the point that Joel has raised.
Okay, first I would just want to say, Brian, that last point that you raised is something I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. So if you want to contact me about that, I'd be interested. There's a, Joel, there's a lot in what you said, and I have mixed feelings about it. Again, it goes possibly for me, that distinction I made before about post-growth and degrowth. None of these things are going to bring about degrowth. They are absolutely essential for post-growth. The systems that we have in place to support each other when we reach that state. I don't know if that was what you were really asking me or asking people. That, yeah. Perhaps if we just leave it as an observation for people to talk about, and unless.
Okay. Well, we're a bit over, and I'll just make some closing comments. And first of all, thank you, Hugh. I think you've done a terrific job at presenting some very complex ideas and helping us with some of the major themes and issues and contradictions even within the the degrowth movement itself, and as well as some of the directions that may go forward. It's not surprising we haven't come to a conclusion about simple actions to take in the last 2 hours. As I said, this is an unprecedented predicament we're in, and it's going to take some time. And of course, we don't have a lot of time. I mean, there's a sense of urgency here because we're doing destruction on a daily basis. As a possible next step, I wanted to alert everyone not only to the fact that this series of webinars is devoted to the same issue of we don't necessarily use the degrowth terminology, but the economy of enough is about the same concepts, same issues, same goals, same sense of urgency. Also, Deirdre Kent has begun a degrowth group. And I'm sure Deirdre would be happy for us to put up some information about that on our Climate Declaration website. So when we put up a copy of this session that we're recording, we'll also put up some information about the initiative that Deirdre is taking, so that anyone, whether you're part of the Degrowth Greens or just interested and concerned about these issues and would like to continue not just the conversation for the sake of a conversation, but for the sake of how do we move forward? What actions can we collectively take and build some synergy together to make things happen that need happening? Stick with the Degrowth Greens if that's where you're already involved, or link in with what Deirdre is doing, or do both. There's no limitations on this except your own time and energy. So again, thank you very much, Hugh. Thank you all who participated. My apologies to those of you who I had to cut short. Each of those conversations would have been very, very desirable to follow, but we'll just have to leave it for another time and honor the timing that we have set for this session.
If anybody wants to follow up any of those points, please do get in touch. And if anybody has any nuts and bolts suggestions for what might go into a transition plan, about the process of building a transition plan, about anything to do with that, I would be delighted to hear from you. Thank you.
Right. Or join us for the next webinar next month. Okay, good night, everyone. Thank you very much. Be well, stay well, act locally.